In the second part, we already know that we might get different responses for the question about sources of moral ideas. Now, let's take a moment to think about the issues Edward Westermark considers. First of all, is it possible to take a critical stance toward traditional customs and practices? We will use four case studies to demonstrate. The first case is one conventional practice in modern time, colonization. The map on the left shows the pre-Hispanic people who live in the southern Patagonia, who are also believed as the southernmost indigenous people in the world. Before Europeans had contact with them, they had been living in the area for centuries. Anthropologists also have uncovered evidence to prove that their ancestors were residents around this area up to 6,500 years ago. The first interaction between the Yagan people, one of the indigenous tribes, and European explorers took place in 1624. In 19th century, more European missions were established, and with more frequent interactions, epidemics of typhoid, measles, and smallpox brought by the European settlers led to the death of around 19% of Yagan population. The population declined from an estimated 3,000 in the 1860s to just 200 people at the turn of the 20th century. Because of the vanishing of those people and also their culture, it is a moral question whether colonization is morally right or not. For people who defend colonization, they might argue that European settlers brought advanced civilization to the indigenous people. Well, for the indigenous people, they might have a totally different opinion about this. The second case is the slavery trade. Slavery has existed throughout the world since ancient times, and the trading in slaves has been equally universal. However, what this map shows is the history between 1650 and 1860. During this time, Africans were shipped, sold, and enslaved for their human labor. Over 2 centuries, the enslavement of black people in America created wealth, opportunity, and prosperity for millions of European settlers. For black people, their freedoms were deprived. Socially, it also produced huge racial conflicts, even affecting today. For people who uphold slavery trade, do they ever think that slavery trade is morally wrong? I doubt. It is very likely that they do not consider it is in their moral scope. So, slavery trade is another conventional practice that we have changed our attitudes towards it. The third case here was a practice carried out by Asian Chinese girls around 10 centuries ago. Girls had their feet bent typically from the age of 5 to 8, and the purpose is to make their feet as small as possible for aesthetic reasons. The distorted aesthetics considers small feet of upper-class girls are very beautiful and very attractive. Later, the practice became widespread and not limited to the upper-class girls. The process was very painful and permanent. You can see from the right picture about how foot bending changed the bone and limited the mobility of females. Foot bending as a practice was only abandoned in the beginning of 20th century. This is another social custom worthy of moral reflection. A similar practice in the West is the corset, also for aesthetic reasons, to make a smaller waist and a bigger butt. You could observe how this practice affected the physical health. Particularly, it causes a lung filled with mucus, cough, and breathing issues. This practice was also abandoned gradually, but in 20th century there are revivals of this practice. Disregard the physical problems it might cause. So, when we think about the above conventional practices and customs, normally we will see that it seems to be when we change our moral standings, we are actually enlightened. That means, formerly, we think it is not morally wrong to conduct all those traditional practices and customs. However, with time passed by, we are intellectually informed with better information, and now we consider those practices and customs are morally wrong. Or we could see that we change our ignorance or misunderstanding to a better informed status quo. However, Westermarck was not going to make this point. He states that the emotional constitution of man does not present the same uniformity as a human intellect. That is to say, your emotional waves might decide in the morning you think you should buy a meal for a homeless people. After working hours for the entire day, you are too tired to give your sympathy to him. And higher emotions are determined by cognitions. The intellectual consideration and education do affect our moral thinking. His point is, there is something we missed here when we talk about intellectual consideration and moral judgment. To be specific, in his words, a sufficiently developed moral consciousness presupposes an objectivity of the moral judgment, which at the same time seems to be proven. That is to say, if we consider intellectual consideration affects our morality, then the goal of this intellectual consideration or moral judgment is some sort of objectivity or moral truth. The problem is we have to assume or presuppose this objectivity to prove it. Let's put it in a very simple way. That's to say, the presumed objectivity is going to be proved. For Westermarck, this is the difficulty of stating that there is an objective moral truth. The presumed objectivity of moral judgment thus being a chimera to the argument. Chimera, as we know, that is an imaginary monster creature patched up by different animals' parts. There can be no moral truth in the sense in which this term is generally understood. Because of this chimera, Westmark considers that he has to give up the objectivity of moral judgment or the intellectual consideration of moral judgment. He eventually concludes that the moral concepts can only be based upon emotions, which fall entirely outside the category of truth. Okay, so what about the emotions? We will talk about emotions in our next lecture. And that is all for lecture 1. After you finish your learning for this lecture, remember to finish the quiz for this lecture. Thanks, and I will talk to you soon in the second lecture.